go any further, I wanted to thank our board and our funders. This conference and the work of purpose-built communities does not happen without the generosity of our three funders, Mr. Warren Buffett, Mr. Julian Robertson and the Robertson Family Foundation, and of course, Mr. Tom Cousins and the Cousins Family Foundation. We're thrilled today to have Alex and Julian here representing the Robertson Family Foundation. Lillian Giornelli is here from the Cousins Family Foundation. So please, if you have a chance, if you see them, please thank them for their generosity and share your stories with them. They'd love to hear about what work you're doing. They are thrilled to have the kind of presence we've got around the country now, the size of this room, the number of folks involved. I mean, it's really their vision coming true here. So please reach out to them when you have a chance. So one of the things that the board asked to do last year is to begin to look and have conversations with potential national funders of this work. So as you all know who are engaged in this work, almost all of the financing that makes these projects happen come from local resources. But as we get bigger, we think we can begin to attract national funding for some of these projects, particularly to do some things like closing some capital gaps in the plans that we've developed with you, funding early learning centers, funding schools, funding YMCAs. And so we've been putting together a strategy for how to begin those conversations. And as it happened, you may have heard that last spring, the MacArthur Foundation began a new competition that they call 100 and Change. And it's an interesting idea. What they decided to do was to spend $100 million on a single organization that's trying to tackle a big problem. And we decided to apply for this, not so much that we thought we would win it. This may be the most competitive public grant process in history. They're expecting over 1,000 applications. It's a global competition. But we thought we would apply it as a means to sort of begin to get our messaging together, begin sort of our national conversations with other potential funders. And so I wanted to show you the video that we had to produce as part of our application. So let me just show that to you now. After listening to Nick last night, I started thinking about the fact that some of you know that I have a 12-year-old daughter. And 12-year-olds, as you may recall, tend to complain a lot. And whenever she does, I take the opportunity to remind her how fortunate she is. She has two reasonably high-capacity parents. She has no material needs. She gets everything she needs to eat, to sleep. She lives in a safe, prosperous neighborhood with great schools and plenty of things to do. And so at one point, I decided to do the math for her. For those of you who know me, won't be surprised by that. I figured out that, and I told her this. I said, Alana, you're starting life with an advantage over 99.99% of the children that are born on this planet. And of course, then I say, go eat your vegetables. But in many ways, the way I think about it, and what I also tell her is, if she doesn't lead a happy, prosperous life, it's pretty much on her. The opportunities she have. How's that for some fine parenting? So you take my daughter, you put her over here for a second, and so last week, Danny Shoy and I, you guys know Danny, we attended a conference on racial equity, and it was a bunch of NGOs and foundations talking about equity and really in the work that a lot of the nonprofit sector does around the country. And there was a lot of discussion around the systems change that people are trying to implement to improve people's opportunities in life and get them out of poverty, versus what they were calling individual-based programs, which was about how do you help folks get over the obstacles in life. And one woman stood up and gave a rather a long talk about how important it was to send the message to children who live in poverty that they can escape and get over the obstacles that they face in life. And in the room, I think there was pretty much uniform consensus that we're not spending enough dollars and enough energy in helping people get through these obstacles. And while she was speaking, it occurred to me that message is absolutely right for the kid in these neighborhoods, for the kids in these neighborhoods, that you can get over these obstacles, but that our energy is misplaced if we are not dedicating ourselves to eliminating those obstacles. And when I was listening to Nick last night, you just hit the Jack in the video calls them toxic sources of stress. I mean, Nick was facing all these obstacles in his life, and he's managed to maneuver his way through that to be what appears to be a prosperous, happy man. But how many of those kids cannot get through those obstacles? And then it made me think, and then we saw, when Fred spoke last night, he put up that really cool graphic that showed the apples and the different sized individuals, and he was saying, if you really want equity, we should be making sure that everybody can reach an apple regardless of how tall they are. But then it made me think, well, that's true. We should be handing out boxes to folks to make sure that they can reach the apple. But when you listen to Jack in the video and he talks about how people's genetic profile and how it is expressed is a direct consequence of the conditions in which they're raised. And when you heard David this morning talking about how it actually those influences are before that child is even conceived, then maybe handing out boxes isn't the most important thing to be doing. Maybe it's changing the conditions in which these kids are actually being born into. And I think that's really what we do here. I think this group and the folks who are engaged in this work are really trying to change the conditions. And the other thing that David showed, it's amazing how many quotes of Martin Luther King. Every conference I go to, I see a new quote that I've never seen before, and I've read a lot of King. But when he showed the quote from King, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It understands that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." And that is what we're doing. That's the business that we are in. We are attacking the edifice. We are making sure that the kids that grow up in these neighborhoods do not have these obstacles that they have to overcome. And that's why our work is so disruptive. And that's why it's so hard. And if you ask our 16 executive directors who are here today how hard it is, they'll tell you the stories of how hard it is to get folks to be disruptive and to attack the edifice of the challenges that these kids face in these neighborhoods. So, as part of this conversation we're trying to have with national funders, we started doing some more analysis around federal and nonprofit foundation spending on poverty. And it's interesting, this work is still underway, but at this point we're pretty confident that you could say that 90% of the resources that the federal government spends, that foundations spend, is dedicated to poverty relief. Just handing out boxes to folks, making sure, and that is hugely important, right? Because people need places to live, and people need food, and that those are necessary interventions. But if all those resources are going towards poverty relief, what dollars are being spent on poverty eradication, in eliminating the obstacles that these kids and these families face? And so we think, we would argue, that if those numbers are even remotely accurate, this is why we're not moving the needle on poverty in this country. We are relieving it, relieving the consequences of poverty, but we're not actually attacking it at its root. Now, Carol mentioned earlier, and Shirley mentions in the video, that we estimate that there are 825 of these neighborhoods in the country, urban neighborhoods with high levels of distress. And what's really interesting about this work that we do is that we get to travel around and see all these neighborhoods. And even though every neighborhood is different, they also have very similar histories. And you can pretty much conclude, at least I have, that a series of racially discriminatory housing policies, education policies, and a set of other public policies has really engineered these neighborhoods to fail. This is not an accident that they're failing. I don't think it's too hard. I don't think engineered is too hard of a term to use here. I think it is. They have been engineered. In fact, if those policies didn't completely work, they decided to put highways through the middle of these neighborhoods. So later in this conference, we're going to be talking some more about what constitutes healthy neighborhoods. And so one of the things that we struggle with is, what does a healthy neighborhood look like? We're in the business of creating healthy neighborhoods, but we actually don't have a very well-defined understanding of what that looks like. What's the right income balance in a healthy neighborhood? What's the right racial balance in a neighborhood? These are key questions to us, because as we trigger these revitalization efforts, we really need to have a better understanding of what the future of these neighborhoods really ought to be. And frankly, it's kind of vague to us. So you're going to be hearing from Ryan Gravel later in the conference. He'll talk about what he would say is the investments in public infrastructure that create spaces that we want to live in. You're going to hear from Josh Yates at the University of Virginia, who's doing this really interesting work called the Thriving Cities Project, trying to understand the data and the analysis that can tell you whether a neighborhood is healthy or not. But as a means to advancing that conversation today, and I hope you'll talk about this issue as the conference proceeds, and maybe tonight we can have some more conversations about what constitutes a healthy neighborhood. We were talking about it last night a little bit. But we're thrilled to have two speakers to come join me up here on the stage today to give us a sense of the experiences they've had in understanding what really constitutes healthy communities around the country. Jim and Deb Fallows, their bios are on the website and on the program that you can see, so I won't belabor all of the biographical facts. But the way I would describe them, and I've been reading Jim since I was a kid. I hate to date you, Jim, but really since I was a kid. They are part of a shrinking cohort in this country where we can go to for just simple wisdom. That's how I would describe it. The national discourse, there's so little of it these days, of where wisdom is the center of what people are trying to talk about. We have that, I think, that deficit in the way that we talk to each other these days. But I think you'll find Jim and Deb to be purveyors of wisdom, and we hope to get some of that today. So Jim and Deb have been married for 40 years, happily married for much of that time. According to Jim, I had to write that down to make sure I got that right. That's a direct quote. Jim is a journalist, Deb is a linguist. They have been bringing those alternative perspectives to their work for many years. They work for the Atlantic magazine and others. They've written books. They've done a large set of work around China, really experts in the sort of evolution of China in recent years. But for the past couple of years, they've been traveling around the U.S., literally flying their own plane around to small towns and small cities around the U.S. as part of a project for the Atlantic called City Makers American Futures. And so the way I would describe it, I'm sure you guys can describe it better, but the way I would describe it is they're trying to understand how different kinds of cities and towns in this country are creating healthier and better communities. And they've written a series of articles that are really interesting. I urge you to go look at them after the conference if you haven't already. But I think why we find that their contribution would be so unique here is because they've traveled to many of the places that we work and other places that have had experienced distress in recent decades, a lot of places where there's been deindustrialization, and they've really been kind of teasing out the lessons they've learned from those experiences. And we just thought it would be fun to have a conversation with them